As we move from gathering to listening, our scripture reading today is from the book of Joshua, chapter 2, verses 1 through 16. Then Joshua the son of Nun secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. "Go, look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab: "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them." But she had taken them up on the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard that the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard about it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to me and my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." "Our lives for your lives," the men answered her and assured her. "If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land." So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was a part of the city wall. She said to them, "Go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Morning, church. My name is Sean. Wow, that's great. I'm one of the pastors on the team, and I regret to inform you I am not nearly as talented as any one of those 3 young women that were on the stage. All right, let's give them another round of applause. Today, we are continuing on in the summer season, even though it doesn't feel like it's summer outside. I see a lot of fall fits out there for June, start of summer. But we are picking up where we left off last summer, and we are diving into the books of Joshua and Judges. As you heard from Pete last week, if you were in the park, maybe you listened later, the book of Joshua as a whole is R-rated. There is violence, there is treachery, there is sexually explicit material. It's the type of book that might end up on a banned books list somewhere, right? So throughout both Joshua and Judges, we have to wrestle with all sorts of moral, theological, ethical problems. There are some things that feel uncomfortable with our modern sensibilities, and there are some things we're like, no, that's just wrong, okay? We know that now, and that is wrong. And we're going to talk a lot more about the violence that is present in this book over the next few weeks. But today, as we heard from Gary, we get to talk about Rahab. And the elephant in the room is that the main character in our text is described as a prostitute. I'm just going to go ahead and get that out there. We're going to talk about that a lot today. So if you need to get comfortable talking about prostitutes, prostitution, sex, whatever it is, do that internal work now. Because here's the deal with Rahab. Rahab, that's my wife. Okay. Rahab is important, okay? And I'm not just talking about, stop laughing back there, okay? I'm not just talking about in our text today. Rahab is important in the big picture story of God. She will be mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. If you know one of them, you know that she is essential to the story of Jesus. And the story of Rahab is important to the theology of the book of Joshua, but it is also important to our faith as a whole today. So let's recap briefly how we have arrived at our text. There was the call of Moses. There was the exodus out of Egypt, the parting of the sea, the giving of the 10 commandments, a time of wandering in the wilderness, and assurance from God that he will give the Israelites the land that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants. And as one quick aside, since it's been in the news over the last few weeks, we've been getting a lot of questions about this, is God's promises to the Israelites as his people in the Old Testament does not have a one-to-one correlation with the nation of Israel today. That is a much bigger discussion. We'd love to have that with you, but just as an aside. So where we are in our text, the Israelites are on the other side of the Jordan where Moses passes away. And the leadership of their tribe passes to Joshua, as we heard last week. And as the book of Joshua begins, God instructs Joshua to lead the Israelites across the Jordan River and enter the land which God is giving them. But the details about how to do that are pretty vague. He isn't given specific instructions how entering into possession of the land would work. There wasn't an instruction manual. There wasn't a punch list. There wasn't a calendar of events for Joshua to follow. So we see what he does first with verse 1 of our text. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Seriously? Okay. He said, go look over the land, especially Jericho. So not entirely sure what to do, Joshua says, all right, I'm going to send 2 spies out first to check out the land, check out more specifically Jericho. And actually 38 years before our story, Moses had sent 12 spies to report on this land that God had promised that he would give them. And this story actually mimics that one a little bit. But with Moses, only 2 of those 12 spies returned with a faithful report that God would indeed give the land to his people. One of those spies that returned was the newly appointed Joshua, and his good friend Caleb was the other. And so if the Israelites were to take control of this land, this Canaan from the east, dealing with Jericho was kind of the first challenge on that journey. It's a logical first step, a logical location to start from. Jericho was an oasis in the midst of a barren landscape, 1,000 feet below sea level. It's incredibly dry, but Jericho itself possesses abundant water still to this day. It was an important and strategic site. But still, in verse 1, tells us even more. So they went, and they entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. So I said, again, we're going to talk about awkward stuff today. And this first verse kicks us right off. Joshua, he sends 2 spies, presumably 2 of his most trusted representatives because of his own experience as a spy. We see Joshua, he says, go look out over the land, especially Jericho. Go do this thing. And in the same verse, the next thing we hear about them is they spent the night at the home of a sex worker. We don't hear about any reconnaissance. We don't hear about how many security guards there are on the wall or weaknesses in the defenses. Nope. Joshua sends 2 spies, and the next thing we know, they seem to be in a brothel. Okay? This is awkward. This is strange, right? We're going to talk about Rahab here in a second, but commentators have tried to figure out throughout the years how to make sense of the spies ending up here almost immediately. Because at first glance, it's not a great look, right? Okay? If we put our most gracious hats on, everybody do that. We're going to put our gracious hats on, all right? We can see that the text carefully avoids implying a sexual liaison between the spies and Rahab. The language here is talked about going into the house and spending the night. It's actually very different from other sexual encounters in the Old Testament. If you think of someone like Samson, who had sex with a prostitute, it is totally different words and verbs that are used that make it very clear about what Samson is doing when he goes to the house of a prostitute. Other interpreters offer another helpful way to think about this is kind of like a Wild West saloon, okay? If you think of a movie like Tombstone or any other kind of Western, the saloon was where you went for food, drink, lodging, and potentially more explicit activities. So this way, the saloon, it would be a place that was frequented by men and frequented by travelers. It was a good place to get information, and it was a good place to hide amidst other unknown faces of travelers. So you can take or leave that explanation, but it's how some people have tried to put this weird happenstance into greater context. And so finally, we have to talk about Rahab. Again, as the text says, she was a prostitute. Today, we might use the term sex worker. Anyone remember learning about Rahab in Sunday school? Okay, maybe a few. If you did, she wasn't described as a prostitute. She was a landlord or an innkeeper, right? Oh, yeah, what was the other one? No? Someone said something. No, all right, that's fine. She was a landlord, innkeeper, whatever it is. And these are words that we use because we're uncomfortable talking about sex in church, right? And so what we have to know about our text is that the author of this story is setting up Rahab as a paragon of otherness. Okay, that's a fancy phrase, but what it means is that narrator wants the reader to expect nothing positive from Rahab, and that this story is actually a great reversal. If you think about it, Rahab embodied pretty much the opposite of the traditional values held by the original folks who would be hearing the story. She was a resident of Jericho, a place that they're trying to go attack and conquer, a Canaanite. They got to take that land. She was a female. She was a sex worker. These are all cues to the original audience that she is a bad, bad girl and one not to be trusted. She is a villain. We are not supposed to believe, based on this first verse, that she can be good or that she can be the hero. And I think if we're honest too, it's easy for us to judge Rahab right away, again, when we hear her described as a prostitute. I actually read this fascinating article about Rahab where they performed a survey of two different groups of people, and they asked them primarily this question. They said, what are the first three words that come to mind when you hear the name Rahab? And the first group of people surveyed was a group of Protestant church-going women. So they're familiar with the story. And without fail, their first words were words like prostitute, harlot, streetwalker, okay? And if you know the text, that makes sense. But a second survey was conducted by an organization that does outreach to sex workers, similar to an organization we work with called Expose Hope. And they asked that specific group of women, those sex workers, the exact same question. And the words that they responded with were courageous, brave, helper, protector, unselfish, and promise keeper. So in a more open-ended portion of the survey, many of them said the same thing, that they didn't know anybody that wanted to be in the business of sex work. So we have often framed Rahab as this Jezebel-type character, and more likely she was the victim of an economic system in which women had almost no opportunities to earn a living. We know later on that she has a large family that she cares for, and women like herself often found themselves on the edge of life with slavery or prostitution as their only options. So I want to be clear, I am not condoning prostitution. I never imagined having to say that out loud, but what I am saying is that when we read that Rahab is a prostitute, maybe that should lead us towards sympathy rather than judgment. Whether that's in their original context or in ours, we immediately think of Rahab as other, as outside the bounds of what is acceptable. But that is not how God sees her, and that is not how she is a part of the story. So the next thing that happens in our story is that the king of Jericho finds out about the spies. Clearly, they're not very good at this whole spying thing because they realize who they are almost immediately. And so he says to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house because they have come to spy out the whole land. Rahab has already hidden them on the roof under some plants, and she says, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. And so the group of soldiers get sent on a wild goose chase by Rahab, and we get another strange part of the story that we get to celebrate: lying. Yes. All right. Prostitution and lying. We're covering it all, okay? So this happens pretty quickly in the story, but I am sure this was a very hard thing for Rahab to do. Essentially, she is committing treason against her own king and her own people. She harbors enemies, she helps them, she lies to the king and his soldiers about what she is doing. Apparently, things aren't as black and white as they seem, because we will go on to celebrate Rahab for this deception. Just last week, I read a story in the New York Times about a woman named Martha Cohn. Martha died last week, and she was a Jewish woman who was born in 1920, just on the French side of the border between France and Germany. She was trained as a nurse, but she worked as a spy with the French resistance against Nazi occupation during World War II. Her intelligence, I'd never heard of her before, but her intelligence saved many lives. She would go on to be awarded many medals, and some people say that she helped hasten the end of World War II by a few weeks. And it's a fascinating article. You should go check it out, but I was struck by a quote from her. There's a book about her story, there was a documentary about her, and when they interviewed her for the documentary, they asked her this question. She said, "What is one life lesson that you would like to impart to people watching this documentary?" And Ms. Cohn replied, "Be engaged and don't accept any order that your conscience could not approve." Don't accept any order that your conscience could not approve. Like Ms. Cohn, for Rahab, even though she was lying, even though she was committing an act of treason, she knew she could not betray her conscience on this matter, no matter what any king or ruler asked of her. It's an important lesson for us today, but why did Rahab, a Canaanite from Jericho, feel this way? Well, in verse 9, she says this: "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you." She goes on to say how they heard about the Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea, the defeat of two other rival kings. And then she says, "For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." And it's this confession at the end that's actually shocking. Rahab becomes the first Gentile convert recorded in the Old Testament. This Jericho resident, this Canaanite, this female sex worker, set up as the one to despise, has just confessed belief in the one true God. The look on the spies' faces must have been one of shock, probably similar to the faces of the Israelites who would go on to hear this story over the years for the first time. And so what's happening here? Well, first, she confesses belief that Yahweh is God in heaven above. There's no God bigger or better than him. And she confesses that Yahweh is the God of the earth. He's not just up there and disinterested and not involved. He is active and alive here too. Rahab goes beyond a faith declaration as she reveals that she knows what God is about to do. She says, "I know that the Lord has given you this land." She seemed to have more confidence in this truth than even the spies themselves. Theologian David Oginde puts it like this. He says, "Whereas Israel was still surveying the land to see whether the Lord could give it to them, here was a Canaanite woman stating that she knew, as a matter of fact, that God had already given the land to Israel." So what does she do next? Well, she makes a deal with the spies to ensure the safety of her entire family. In verse 12, she says, "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you." We said before that Rahab is brave and strategic and cunning, and this is on full display here. She has the spies exactly where she wants them. She enters into this treaty, this agreement with them to make sure that her entire family is spared in the future attack. And what's fascinating to me is this word translated in our Bibles as kindness is the Hebrew word hesed. And while kindness is certainly part of it, it is a much deeper and more full word than that. It's typically used to describe the faithfulness expected in a covenant relationship, and commonly used to describe the type of faithfulness that God shows to Israel. So Rahab argues to the spies that she has shown that type of commitment, faithfulness, kindness towards them, and she expects them to return the same level of commitment, faithfulness, and kindness to her and her family. And she helps them escape by letting them out her window, as her house was seemingly located in the city wall, and she lowers them to the ground by a rope. The conclusion of the story happens after our text this morning, but they settle on a sign, and Rahab and her family must hang a scarlet cord in the window to signify that they are not to be harmed. The spies escape, they return to Joshua, and they offer this report. The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us. So in a few weeks, we are going to talk about the actual fall of Jericho, but spoiler warning, Joshua keeps the covenant with Rahab, and she and her family survive. But that's not where Rahab's story ends. She actually shows back up in Matthew chapter 1. It starts like this. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. We're going to skip a few. Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. We're going to skip more than a few. You get the picture. And we get to, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. The one who is whispered about in the hallways as a bad, bad girl ends up becoming the great-great-grandmother of King David and the distant matriarch to Jesus, the Christ and Messiah. Why would a gospel writer here in Matthew call out a prostitute turned proselyte from Jericho? Well, Matthew wants his readers to see that God has been using all types of people to move his plan forward. That his readers, the Jewish faithful at the time, need to understand that God has been using cultural and racial outsiders all along. That they are just as much a part of the community of faith through belief. That even the Messiah himself, Jesus, his lineage, included all sorts of characters and people that we would least expect. But that's not the only time we see Rahab in the New Testament. She shows up in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11 alongside others like Abraham, Isaac, and Moses. And in James 2, in a long discussion about belief without action being useless, it says this, "In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead." Rahab's story may have started in Joshua 2, but it lives on forever in the genealogy of Jesus, and she is two different examples as faith in the New Testament. And this is a somewhat silly example, but I've been thinking about this connection between belief and action a lot recently, because I have been teaching our 3.5-year-old to ride a bike, okay? She was really excited by it. We would talk about it and say, hey, the most important thing for you to do, Penny, is to keep pedaling. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be right here with you, be holding on, but you have got to keep pedaling. That is what you need to do. And she would say, got it, Dad. I will keep pedaling. Well, do you know what would happen next, right? We would get going. I'd be there with her, and I'd give her a push, and immediately she'd just freeze. And she would stop pedaling and then, tilt over and scream and cry. And understandably, she was nervous. She was scared about falling. She had fell many times before. It hurt. This was a new and a scary thing, but she couldn't connect what she knew in her head with what she needed to do with her body, which was to keep pedaling. I'm happy to report she has cleared that hurdle. She has connected belief with action. She is riding her bike like a champ, but this is often a really hard thing for us to do. We're not sure how to figure out that balance. And in Rahab, I see a woman who shows us profoundly what a life of faith and action looks like. That her faith in God started by believing what God had done when God had revealed to her who God was, but her faith was expressed in action. That her knowing led to doing. Before James 2 mentions her, it says this, "Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it?" What if Rahab had greeted the spies like this? "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed. You'll be fine." And she did nothing to aid them. They would have died immediately on orders from the king of Jericho. Instead, she takes the action that she does because of recognizing who God is. She does her part in the process where we see God take her small act of faithfulness and use it for God's big kingdom purposes. Not only does Rahab show us about belief, she confirms her faith, and then she acts to preserve God's people and to advance God's kingdom. Not too shabby for a female Canaanite sex worker from Jericho. Like those original listeners of this story, and even those who may have been puzzled by the genealogy of Jesus, including someone like Rahab, I think our text is challenging us to think about who we think of as other. As we said before, Rahab is clearly an outsider. She was someone not to be trusted. There are many examples in movies and stories of the person who is originally set up as the villain who turns into the hero. Are there any Harry Potter fans out there? Okay. Yes. Okay. Think of Professor Snape. Okay. Someone that we are trained to nearly hate for the entirety of the story, but we end up with a completely different picture in the end. And the statute of limitations is passed if you haven't read that. Okay. I'm not apologizing. All right. The book of Joshua is one of the most nationalistic books in the Old Testament. And this story comes at the dawn of their national history as they take the land promised to them. Why would there be a story at the very beginning of a nationalistic text about a foreigner? Maybe this was actually the perfect place to insert a story about foreigners, about outsiders, about the others being integral to the story of God. Maybe God knew that we would have a tendency to fear the other, or to blame the other, to look down on immigrants, or to accept it as okay to have community members taken by masked people off the street, to label certain people as others, to make violence or war seem okay. Maybe God knew we needed to see a story about an outsider whose role in the big story of God was indispensable. Because in a similar way, maybe this story challenges us about who grace is available to. Maybe we haven't judged Rahab as an outsider, but we have judged her for being a prostitute. What we see in the story of Rahab is that it confirms that God's welcome is to all people, whatever their condition or past. That through Christ, everyone is given the opportunity to come to him through faith. That Rahab confesses her belief in God, and she becomes a part of the family line that leads to the birth of Jesus, and she serves as a model of faith for Christians. And yet, we still see someone like her as other. We might even feel as if someone like her isn't worthy of grace. And so I wonder today, who might be the other for you? If we were writing this story, the 2020-25 version, who would we write about in the beginning of the story that would immediately cause you to see them as the villain, as someone not to be trusted, as someone who could definitely not become the hero of the story? Because this text challenges us to examine our own attitudes and perspectives. What stereotypes do we hold? What demanding attitudes and perceptions do we need to dispose of and discard? Whether someone looks different, votes different, is differently abled, believes different, are we willing to make space for others in our hearts and in our community? What would it look like, because we have experienced grace in Jesus, if we rush to grace instead of rushing to judgment? So yes, this story is strange, awkward, confusing, but in the midst of a story with a lot of gray areas, we find God challenging our assumptions about others, our assumptions about grace, of revealing an unlikely hero who is an outsider, and inviting us to leave behind our own tendencies about distrust of others, and instead seeing the inclusive kingdom of God. Of showing how no matter what any king or ruler asks of us, we shouldn't betray our conscience of what we know to be right. Of seeing how we can put our belief in God into concrete action to aid God in his reconciling work. So, Antioch family, may we be a people of belief and action as we actively welcome the other and the outsider with our very lives in love. Amen.